So you're trying to make sense of the adjective endings and nothing's working. Well, I get it. You've been studying tables, maybe like these ones, trying to remember the difference between weak endings and strong endings, whatever they are, and asking yourself, so what are declinations? And you're still not sure how to use adjectives properly. Well, let's fix that. Grüß Gott, hallo, ich bin Billy Badger und das ist Bausteine 1. Herzlich willkommen. Now maybe you're one of those people who needs a table of endings to help you make sense of things. Well, fair enough. But for now, I want to show you what I think is an easier way to work with adjectives. First of all, it's important to know that if you're going to describe stuff, that you can use them like this or maybe like this. And one way is easier than the other. And if we're using them all by themselves, so in other words, not in front of a noun, this is the easiest way, as you can see perhaps from these examples. Das Brot ist gelb. Das Gemüse ist frisch. Or der See ist schön. If we're using them like this, then we don't need to do anything with our adjective at all. It's just like you'd find them in the dictionary. But if you wanted to use them tucked in front of a noun, then we need to change the adjective by adding on the right ending. And this ending will depend on a couple of things: the gender of the noun, the sort of article we're using, the case we're in, or whether you're using the singular or the plural, which sounds a bit crazy complicated, doesn't it? But it doesn't have to be. If you've made it to this stage, then you already know most of what you need to. Let's look at what makes it seem complicated, because there are three scenarios that we need to consider, but they all involve the same concept. If we're using a noun, then we'll be referring to it either with a definite article, an indefinite article, or maybe we won't be using an article at all. But let's start off by looking at the definite articles, because they hold the key to what we need to know. You'll remember the definite articles are these ones: der, die, das, at least in the subject case, which is all we're going to look at for now. And you might know this perhaps as the nominative case. Well, the definite articles give us clues about the gender of the nouns they precede. In the subject case, masculine nouns are signalled by that typical ER ending. So we can have words like der See, der Fluss, or der Hafen, and they're all pretty easy to recognize. We spot our feminine nouns because of that very typical E ending. So we have die Stadt, die Band, or die Straßenbahn. And our neuter nouns will of course be preceded by that typical S ending. So I can say das Fenster, das Blatt, or das Boot. Now I haven't mentioned the plurals, but we'll come back to these at the end of the video. Anyway, here's the important thing we need to remember. If our article has the typical ending, then our adjective won't have it. And if our article doesn't have the typical ending, then the adjective will have to have one. Let's see how that works. We'll start off perhaps with the definite articles. Here are three examples. Das ist der Tunnel, das ist die Stadt, und das ist das Rad. You can see these already have the typical ending. So if we're using adjectives, they will need an ending, but not the typical endings. And whichever crazy Germans came up with this system, they decided that an E would be the easiest possible ending. So all of our adjectives, when we're using a definite article, just get an E. So describing our three things, we would say, das ist der lange Tunnel. Das ist die schöne Stadt. Das ist das alte Rad. In each case, there is just an E on the end of the adjective, and only the article has the typical ending. That's not too complicated, is it? But what happens when we use the indefinite article? Well, you already know how the indefinite articles work. So let's use the same examples perhaps. Das ist ein Tunnel, das ist eine Stadt und Das ist ein Rad. And as we know, the indefinite articles don't really have the typical endings. Well, look, I guess you could say the feminine one does, but as you'll see, that doesn't really matter because the feminine ending and the simplest possible ending is the same anyway. It's just that E. And since the indefinite articles don't have the typical endings, any adjectives we use will have to have the typical endings. So at least there's something there to tell us what the gender of the nouns is. Let's use some adjectives. Das ist ein langer Tunnel. Das ist eine schöne Stadt. Und das ist ein altes Rad. In each case, you can see that the typical gender endings are now on the adjective since they weren't on the article. All right, well, what would happen then if we described some nouns without using an article, but only using an adjective? Well, there's only one place for those typical endings to go, isn't there? So that's where they are going to be. I'll show you what I mean. Here are 3 drinks, all with a different gender, and even though I'm not using an article, you can still recognize the gender. Das ist kalte Milch, das ist kalter Saft, und das ist kaltes Wasser. So to my way of thinking, that's actually pretty easy. Let me know in the comments if that makes sense to you too, while we quickly move on to the accusative case, like we might use perhaps for the direct object, like in these sort of sentences. Ich mag den See, ich mag die Stadt, ich mag das Boot. Now, as you'll know, things change a little bit in the accusative, and we've talked about this in a couple of videos lately, like this one on articles. And in particular, it's only really the typical ending for the masculine that changes. And if you know this, and you can remember it, of course, then this is going to be pretty easy because pretty much everything else stays the same. Okay, so there's a couple of ways of thinking about it. So I'll leave it up to you to see which one you think makes more sense. We're going to use adjectives in exactly the same way as before. You'll just do exactly what we've done up until now, except when the noun's masculine, because the typical masculine ending in the accusative is now an en, and it carries across to anything and everything. So it doesn't matter whether I say, ich mag den kalten Saft, ich mag einen kalten Saft, or ich mag kalten Saft. You're just going to use an en ending on absolutely everything. On the article, on the adjective, and of course it doesn't matter whether you're using a definite or an indefinite article. And all of the other forms don't change. They're exactly as they were for the subject case. Feminine stays the same, so we'd have ich sehe die alte Stadt or ich sehe eine alte Stadt. And so does neuter. Ich sehe das kleine Boot, ich sehe ein kleines Boot. This is exactly the same as for the subject case. But there's also another way of thinking about it. Because now, in the object case, in the accusative, all masculine forms always have an en ending and all feminine forms always have an e ending. So there's not much to remember there. It's only the neuter forms where that typical s is either on the article or on the adjective, but not on both. And I find that a little bit annoying, to be honest. It upsets that nice pattern, but grammar is not always completely logical. Oh, and I said we'd come back to the plural. Luckily, it's the same in the nominative case and in the accusative case. So you might see, das sind die Möwen, or ich mag die Möwen. And this is maybe also a bit annoying because it might look a bit like the feminine at first glance. But this is where our adjectives come to our rescue. The typical ending is an e, so if we're using an adjective, it has to have a different ending, which the Germans, in their infinite wisdom, decided would be an en, just so that it's not exactly the same as the feminine. In this case, we'd have sentences like these. Hier sind die weißen Möwen. Ich mag die weißen Möwen. But if we're not using an article, then we just go back to that typical ending for the plural, which is, of course, the e. Ich mag weiße Möwen. And that's it. Things change a bit, of course, when we get to the other cases, so if you want me to do a video on these, let me know in the comments down below. Und so, meine Lieben, ich hoffe, das Video hat euch gefallen. Das war's dann für heute und auch für dieses Video. Danke fürs Zuschauen, alles Gute, auf Wiedersehen und tschüss, bis zum nächsten Mal.